Welcome, everyone. Before I turn the mic over to Terry Green, our senior e-learning designer, to introduce our guest, I'd like to respectfully acknowledge that we're in the treaty and traditional territory of the Mississauga Anishinaabe. We offer our gratitude to the First Nations for their care for and teachings about our earth and our relations. May we honor those teachings. I just wanted to say a few words about the Distinguished Visiting Teaching Scholars Series. This is an event of that series. And when we seek distinguished visiting teaching scholars, we're really seeking thought leaders in certain areas of pedagogy. And when Terry came to me with the suggestion for tonight's guest to come and visit us, I just thought this is the perfect setting and situation, because having spent just a couple of hours with Rajiv today, I've already gotten good value. and lots of really, really great insights into open, inclusive pedagogies. So I'm not going to get into any details. I'll turn it over to Terry to properly introduce Rajiv.
Hi, everybody. My name is Terry Green. I'm senior e-learning designer with Trent Online. And in all the preparations for this event, I forgot to think about what I would say to introduce you. For those of you online, there's a really rowdy crowd here tonight, so you're missing out, but we're glad to have you online. Yeah, Rajiv, if there was like an Olympic finals of talking about open pedagogy and leading institutions towards greater openness in their educational practices, Rajiv would be on the Canadian national team and he'd be a gold medal favorite. We are endlessly excited to have you here tonight. Without further ado, come on up. Dr. Rajiv Jhangiani, Vice Provost, Teaching and Learning from Brock University.
Thank you very much, everyone. Be patient with me as I dismiss messages that I'm seeing on Zoom and as I get set up over here with the microphone. There we go. All righty. Well, Terry is very sweet to give me that introduction because we've known each other for a while. And for those of you who don't know Terry Green, I will share with you. And I say this because sometimes people don't realize the gems that we have within our own institutions. We take them for granted. You don't realize quite how fabulous, quite how famous they are. Terry is a bit of a folk hero in the open education community. And I will tell you, there are many institutions that will eagerly steal him away if they have half the opportunity. Promise not to do it this week. But at the same time, I have to say, in his incredibly humble, understated ways and incredible impact, not the least of which is with the Open Faculty Patchbook, which I hope that some of you have learned about already. So it's a treat to spend time here at Trent, to be here for the first time. For some of you, some of you know that I've only been in Ontario for about almost 7 months at this point, because I spent the last 25 years in British Columbia. And so this is new in many ways. I'm new to Brock, new to Ontario, and I'm eager to make lots of connections. I'm cognizant that I'm looking at a camera that's attached to my laptop over here, and I do not want to speak away from the people who are joining us online. So I hope you're going to be comfortable with me looking both down and up at you as I go. But I do want to say that I'm grateful both to Fergal for the invitation, for Terry for the support, for the CTL team, but I'm especially, of course, grateful to be a guest on this land, which, as Fergal mentioned, is, of course, the traditional and treaty territory of the Mississauga Anishinaabe. And so, I honor the wisdom, the teachings, the languages, and the traditions of the ancestors who've been on this land since time immemorial. As an immigrant settler, I can tell you that I reflect deeply about the history of this land, my relationship with it, and the violence that has been and continues to be perpetrated against Indigenous peoples right across Turtle Island. And I say this because, of course, I'm going to advance my slides over here as I go. My own home, which is in British Columbia, is located on the traditional territory of the Squamish First Nation, ancestral, unceded territory of the Squamish First Nation. And I learned several years ago that it's actually located about 10 minutes away from the site of a former residential school in North Vancouver. you wouldn't know it. I mean, there's a modern day Catholic school on that site. And if you go to the school's website, there's no trace of the history of that. It's just this massive vacuum between when the nuns operated it in the present day school. And that's the sort of history and self-understanding that I think many Canadians have grown up with of a land that reflects the brochures that we sell the world, while not being quite willing to reveal the reality to ourselves. And so I'm grateful for both the learning and the unlearning that I've managed to do, certainly with the assistance of Indigenous elders, colleagues, and students along the way. I think as educators, it is incumbent upon us to build a better world. And I'm going to quote the Honorable Justice Murray Sinclair over here, who of course was the chair of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, who said that education is what got us into this mess, and education is what will get us out of it. The point is that we have a moral obligation over here to respond effectively to the educational calls to action of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. But of course, if you've been paying attention to the broader trends in our society over the last few years, you'll also know that we also have an ethical obligation to follow through on actions that we commit to as part of the Scarborough Charter on anti-Black racism and Black inclusion in Canadian higher education. And also to work towards an in-depth and intersectional understanding of inequity, discrimination, and exclusion as called to in the Dimensions Charter. And so if you aren't familiar with these three documents, I would encourage you to study them and let perhaps studying them be your most important takeaway from today's session, because I think this is what lies at the heart of what our role is in education and the role that education plays in society, right? Without this intention, without this kind of work, I'm going to suggest we should all just go home, because otherwise all we're doing is holding up a system that continues to reinforce and replicate existing societal power hierarchies instead of actually cutting to the core of societal transformation, which is where the promise of this work lies. So as you may have surmised at this point already, I take great inspiration from the work of the late great Bell Hooks, who wrote that her commitment to engaged pedagogy was an expression of political activism. And so for me, I make no bones about this, very transparent. I bring my politics to my work because of course we all do. And especially if you decide that you're not bringing your politics to your work, you are in a hyper-privileged way, but you are. But I take all of the experiences that we've had, and I know some of us have shared these experiences as well. So I came to Canada as an international student, and I remember sharing an apartment with 3 other international students. I remember those moments of food insecurity, and I hold on to that. That informs my approach today. Right? I remember being a sessional adjunct faculty member working at 3 different institutions at one point on the same day, trying to cobble together a full-time job without any real benefits while feeling excluded from collegial governance at the institution. I hold that close. Right? Those are the experiences that shape my work today. And of course, yeah, I think you have many at Trent as well. But usually when people make jokes about moving from a faculty position to administration, they talk often about the dark side. And it's hilarious because it's not that dark, typically. But at the same time, as a BIPOC administrator, I take seriously my role in terms of advancing not just my portfolio, but thinking about how we can better design the academy to be more inclusive, to be more supportive, particularly for those whom it's designed to leave out. Right? When we talk about issues with retention being greater for, let's say, BIPOC students, have to remember, this is not a bug. This is a feature. This is how the system is designed. So we often have to push back so that our faculty who are trying to support their students are not swimming upstream. Now, of course, you'll see this not just in my ideology, but you'll also see it in broader academic planning documents. And I'm sharing this with some pride because it's barely 3 weeks ago that Brock approved our new academic plan. Of course, I helped develop this, and you'll see a lot of my ideology in here now, but with the, reflecting the will and having the support of the university community. So we have 44 actions in the plan, and here are some specific ones. Each of these, of course, is going to have an implementation plan as well. So we're going to talk about developing resources and supports for educators grounded in anti-racist and trauma-informed pedagogies that sustain inclusive and harassment-free learning environments. We'll talk about this a lot today. We'll develop and adopt an ethical framework for educational technologies that ensures the procurement of digital tools do not perpetuate and reinforce systemic inequalities and racial biases. We'll talk about that very, very shortly. We're embedding Scarborough Charter principles of Black flourishing, inclusive excellence, mutuality, and accountability into our academic planning, including, of course, through the development of a Black Studies program. And the last one I'll just mention for now is identifying and working to dismantle systemic academic barriers experienced by BIPOC, disabled, 2S, LGBTQ+, and gender diverse faculty, staff, and students, and supports and community that foster inclusive participation and belonging, and that support flourishing. There are 40 other items in the plan, but I think you're getting a sense of the flavor of the plan. This is a determined effort now with the next 5 years at Brock to make sure the system does not, in fact, perpetuate societal hierarchies. Now, of course, I spent some time looking at what was happening at Trent, and so I was very pleased to see that there'd been some similar reflections in previous years. And I say this in part because often when you go to university, you look at their vision statement, mission statement, academic plan, institutional strategic plan. To be honest, it's a little bit like buzzword bingo, a little bit. Like you can have a scorecard and there'll be things around student-centered and inclusion and whatnot. But this is what I see, right? It's in your vision statement, talking about inclusive, intellectual, social, and community, valuing collaboration. It's in your board directions under theme 1, about advancing reconciliation, equity, diversity, and inclusion initiatives, responding to the anti-racism task force. It's also in your academic guiding principles, where social justice will continue to be a focus. And of course, you've got diversity, equity, and inclusion in all aspects of academic endeavor. Again, this is great, right? This is a start. But I will say that many cases, too often I would say this is where it ends as well. Right. So what I would hope happens, and I say this knowing that Michael is in the room as well, is that people, including folks at Senate, hold the university accountable when it comes to these shared documents that the universities agreed on, right? Otherwise, it will continue to be what we all do so well in the academy, which is performative allyship. Right? We're so good at that. The point is, and this is what we used to do at my former institution in British Columbia, Kwantlen Polytechnic University. This was one of our banners. This was the focus, right? Too often universities design for the mode. But the point is, if you design for the margins, of course, this is where everybody benefits. So as I begin over here, I will encourage you to not just reflect on what I'm talking about, but maybe also reflect on the values that you bring to this work as educators, right? Think about what attracted you to this work in the first place. And I say this because the academy has a way of beating this out of you over time. But it's the reconnection to those values that is really where the spark lies. So when it comes to teaching and learning, of course, this makes a huge difference. And I would say it especially makes a difference when we talk about digital teaching and learning, which is, of course, what many of us have been doing for the last 2.5 years. I'm going to give you some examples of this. As you can see, algorithms are certainly not apolitical, and this is one of the many resources that I will point to if you're interested in learning more. Safia Noble is an incredible scholar, of course. And so Google search, I would say, is a good example. In this book, Safia writes that search is a symbiotic process that both informs and is informed in part by users. And yet, if the majority rules in search engine results, then how might those who are in the minority ever be able to influence or control the way in which they are represented in a search engine? Or today I might extend in ChatGPT responses. Right? So consider the results that show up when you Google unprofessional hairstyles for work. That's an illustration. And compare these with the results that show up in Google when you enter professional hairstyles for work. Just a subtle illustration, not that subtle. Or consider when you paste text into Google Translate, right? From Finnish to English. And I say this because Finnish is a language that has just one pronoun for the third person, regardless of gender. It translates it into English, not just in a way that is gendered, but also sexist, right? He is a journalist. He is a leader. She is exhausted. She has a grandchild. You can see the theme over here. Algorithms are not apolitical. None of this is an accident, just as the development of, I would say, racist soap dispensers, which is an odd phrase to use, that failed to detect Black customers' hands was not an accident, right? Who's on the development team? What does the testing look like? Who was at the table? These are basic questions. So it's a function of design. And it's also a reflection and amplification of societal biases, of unquestioning techno-solutionism and dominant and male culture. And this is why I say higher education is not immune to this, right? This is how we end up with digital textbook platforms that do not include proper accessibility tools, right? You have your accessibility offices hurrying around trying to retrofit the technology that we procure. This is how we end up with learning management systems that default to legal names. And so it ends up dead naming trans students, This is what the reality is. This is how we end up with, for example, remote exam proctoring software with algorithms that more readily flag students with darker skin tones as cheating. Right? This is all part of the design. Second resource, because in her book, this is an incredible book as well, Ruha Benjamin, in her book, Race After Technology, refers to this as the new Jim Code, the employment of new technologies that reflect and reproduce existing inequities, but that are promoted and perceived as more objective or progressive than the discriminatory systems of a previous era, right? It's not me singling out students in my class or international students, reporting them disproportionately for academic integrity violations. It's the AI, it's the algorithm, right? It's not me. And so this is the point. This has been said many times. If you're not at the table, you're probably on the menu, right? And this is why design justice is so important. Another book, as Sasha Constanza Schock writes in her book, Design Justice, this is a framework for analysis of how design distributes the benefits and the burdens between various groups of people. So design justice focuses explicitly on the ways that design reproduces and or challenges the matrix of domination. That can include anything from white supremacy, heteropatriarchy, capitalism, ableism, settler colonialism, and other forms of structural inequality. And I raise all of these examples because our systems, our technologies, because people often talk about how higher education has this transformative potential, how it's this tool with which we can unlock human potential. It's a vehicle for economic and social mobility, right? I confess, though, the more I study higher education and its structures, the more I see ways both blunt and subtle that, in fact, we end up replicating and reinforcing existing societal power hierarchies. Few people realize that Article 26 of the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights speaks to the importance of equal access to higher education. And yet, despite this promise, the reality, I would suggest, is quite different. Over the decades, higher education has slowly evolved. And as Tressie McMillan Cotton has written, it's gone from being an individual good rather than a collective good that benefits society, right? So far from being a universal human right, it's now become an individual privilege in many ways. And I think one extreme indicator of this, even in Canada, even in Peterborough, is the growing problem of food insecurity on our campuses. So I want to touch on this a little bit. And of course, there's been lots of articles written about this. I can tell you what's happening at Brock on this line as well. But it is true at Trent, right? Where, of course, the Trent Student Association has their food one-stop shop. But I also will note from the website that describes it that they're dealing with more demand than they can support. So there's all kinds of limitations right now, right? They ask students to only book one appointment every 2 weeks, to limit to one meat or meat alternative protein from the fridge or freezer. That's, again, once every 2 weeks, right? Limit to 2 fresh vegetables every 2 weeks. You get 1 fresh vegetable a week. That's fabulous, right? So this is here. This is not some different location. This is not in the United States where we can make even bigger allegations about disproportionate treatment of minorities at university. But I will also say that I'm talking about food insecurity for a number of reasons. One of them is that food insecurity is one of the factors that drives a particular thread of emails to faculty members. But the thread of emails I'm talking about is at the start of every semester, maybe a couple of weeks before, you get these emails as a faculty member, right? It's, hey, prof, do I really need the book? May I use an older edition? Right? This is the chorus of emails. It happens every semester. It happens at every university. And I know that sometimes faculty members respond to these emails, at least internally, with some degree of derision or contempt. Right? I'll often hear this at faculty meetings. If you value education, you should buy this book. Some people say if they have money for beer, surely they have money for books. I mean, this kind of rhetoric is not uncommon. But I will say that those faculty don't realize a few things. For one, the cost of commercial textbooks, since these data have begun to be tracked, which was in 1977, has risen by over 1,000% since 1977, right? And it really doesn't matter between then and, let's say, 2018. You could take any 5-10-year period, and it's typically been rising between 3 and 4 times the rate of inflation. So you cannot even compare it to inflation in that way. So, of course, what you're seeing right at the end to some degree, if you're looking at college textbooks over there, and these data are from the US, but it's very similar for us, is a bit of a plateau just in the last 3-4 years. There's a number of things that explain that. There's been major affordability initiatives, of course. There's been the impact of open textbook, adoptions, other things like that. But many more people have been asking questions about the affordability of textbooks when we realize we're living in the era of the $400 textbook and a textbook that's paired to an access code where students have to pay money in order to do their homework, right? This is the reality. But I will say that the commercial textbook industry has been well aware of this. We are all familiar, certainly if you're an instructor, with these unsolicited packages in your mailbox, the so-called new editions with only cosmetic changes, right? This is their business model. And so I'm going to quote the CEO of Cengage, who in 2018 wrote that there are millions of students out there who are making very painful trade-offs in the purchase of learning materials relative to paying the rent, paying for basic needs, food, and so on. We as an industry have chosen for a long time to basically ignore that, he wrote. He actually wrote this, which is incredible, or have more or less been paying lip service to them. Yes, we know. And I share this because, sometimes people wonder whether you can ever fully reconcile a primary obligation to shareholders with a primary duty to students. I suggest this is evidence to the contrary. Nonetheless, I would say even prior to the pandemic, and we can talk about the pandemic impact, we know that this was an issue. This was an issue in BC, it was an issue in Ontario. These are data from 23 different institutions in British Columbia, where we had several hundred students indicate that a slight majority were not purchasing at least some of their course materials because of cost. That's how that sentence ended in the survey. About 30% earned a poor grade. They took fewer courses, didn't register for a specific course, and so on, all because of the cost of textbooks. The poor grade piece is quite fascinating to me, because I would say, particularly before the pandemic, where the move to digital, of course, got accelerated, there was often an unusual calculus where the question was, how much of my grade is coming from the online quizzing that's associated with a textbook? And if it was 10%, they would take the hit on their grade and they would go through the course without buying the book. If it was 30%, then they would have to drop the course. That's the kind of calculus that was happening very often. Now, of course, the pandemic made this even worse, especially when we were at the same time demanding that students purchase laptops, expensive webcams, right at the time when they lost all of their employment, which was a fun thing we did in higher education. But of course, those economic pressures made a huge difference. It also helped in a few positive ways by accelerating the awareness of this issue. And I say this issue because something like textbooks is almost a textbook example of a principal-agent dilemma. So if there's any economists in the room, but when you have a decision that an individual is making that a larger group is bound by, but the individual making the decision is not affected by that decision, you end up with a gulf. And the gulf is often reflected in the fact that about a third of faculty have no idea what the cost is of the resources they're assigning in the first place. That comes from this. And so as a student from one of these qualitative studies wrote, buying a $200 textbook does not hurt as much as buying a $200 textbook that proves to be useless, right? That's the bigger insult. But of course, in the years leading up to today, faculty awareness about this has risen quite a bit. And so many of my colleagues in the faculty have increasingly been asking questions about affordable alternatives to expensive textbooks. They've asked the commercial textbook publisher reps as well. And that's when they'll often say, yes, of course, we have. This is why we have digital versions. We have cheap alternatives. If they want to buy something for maybe 60% of the cost of the print, they can buy a code. Now, of course, they don't buy the code. They lease the code, which is the other question, because they lose access after about 180 days. But I will talk about this a bit because this is a model that's increasingly proliferating. This is often called inclusive access, is the term that the commercial publishers have given this kind of model. Often you have institutions that sign all-in deals, all courses, all classes, all students will pay a flat fee, and in exchange, all of their courses will use the digital delivery of these resources. Again, on the surface, it sounds great, unless you start to remember that, oh, faculty agency, they're limited to one set of options from one set of publisher, all right? Student agency, if they want to opt out of digital and prefer print, as many students do, that's going to be an issue because there'll be limits in the contract for that. And if you look at accessibility, the digital rights management, locking down copying, pasting, printing, means that once again, you're making it harder for the students who need most access to those resources. Hence, wolf in sheep's clothing. So there's lots of reports about this, and you can read the US Berg's reports about automatic textbook billing. But the resource I'll point you to more now is a new website that's been developed called inclusiveaccess.org. And so this is the kind of model that's coming to a campus near you. If it hasn't already come to Trent's campus store, I imagine it's a discussion that's imminent. I would urge you to look at this very critically, and from the lens of those who this initiative would fail, especially. This is, of course, one of the many reasons why I love working with open educational resources. Free, in some ways, I would say, is almost the least significant benefit of open educational resources. Because when we talk about open educational resources, we're talking about things that are not just free, but that come with a set of freedoms. We often refer to these as the 5 Rs. So when we talk about the 5 Rs, we're talking about the rights to reuse, revise, remix, retain, redistribute. And I'll break that down as I'm getting a call right now. Quite fascinating. What does this mean? As a faculty member, you have you are able to reuse a resource freely, unhindered, without asking for permission, of course. You can revise it. You can localize it. You can translate it. You don't have to tell your students, don't read chapter 4, take it out. If there's something missing, you can add it in. I've written open textbooks that have been translated into other languages that are being used around the world. You can never tell how a work is going to be revised downstream. But I will say, this is like a gift that keeps giving, except that it gets more dear every time it's re-gifted. You can remix these resources. So you can take an open textbook, embed openly licensed instructional videos, simulations, all kinds of things, and make it interactive. You can retain it forever. You never lose access to it. So the student who takes anatomy and physiology in first year who wants to go on to med school feels the need to resell that book usually to recover some of that $400 spend. They can keep that reference forever. And of course, you can redistribute it. And I'm saying this because, of course, the power of OER means it's not even limited to textbooks. When we talk about images, I will point to, let's say, the Rijksmuseum or the Met, the New York Metropolitan Museum of Art, are examples of museums that are openly licensing their masterworks, right? This is OER. You can download a 2 GB sized high resolution image of Vincent van Gogh's self-portrait over here. And I'm saying this because art history is a discipline that has among the most expensive textbooks because of the permissions involved. This is OER, right? You can look at videos. Many people use TED Talks for teaching and learning, right? Those sort of bite-sized, glib solutions to complex problems that often carry Creative Commons licenses. But there you go. Interactive simulations. If you teach in STEM disciplines, for example, look at the University of Colorado at Boulder's website. You can download these. They're openly licensed. You can embed that in your learning management system in Blackboard, for example. All OER, right? Do not need to pay for this. Homework solutions, quizzing platforms. WebWork is a great example. The Mathematical Association of America endorsed this, developed this, and tons of universities use this, including UBC, including Kwantlen, including Brock, of course, as well. And then we can talk about textbooks, but it's so much more than textbooks. But if you go to the Open Textbook Library, this is hosted at the University of Minnesota, for example, you will see over 1,000 open textbooks and open reviews by faculty members at institutions that you will recognize, right? These are all open reviews. And they include these. Happy to note a few hometown heroes, right? You will recognize. Help me out. I don't think her name is actually on the, yeah, but Kim, so she's not listed in the editors over here, but Kim English from the nursing program, if I'm not mistaken, contributed to this book. Here's another one, and this is, in fact, Christy Buccieri, I believe. This is another one, and yes, Sanela Martic worked on this one too. So just a few examples of Trent faculty members who have published open textbooks that are being widely reused around the world. And if you're looking for these resources all together and you think, oh my God, I need to go one place for simulations, another place for textbooks, let's make it simple. The State University of New York system developed what I like to think of as a meta search engine for OER. And so you can sort it for any kind of resource you like. And they fittingly call it the Oasis. So oasis.geneseo.edu. By the way, in case you're wondering, these slides will be openly licensed. They will be made available to everybody. I would be a hideous ambassador for open education if I said, no, this is mine. So don't worry, you can take all the screenshots you like, but you'll be able to download the original slides as well very soon. Now, of course, as I said, in some ways, free is the least significant benefit of open educational resources. And I say this because, of course, it has an incredible impact on educational outcomes. We've done some of this research in BC. I've published some of it myself. But here's one of the larger studies that looked at this. This was in the state of Georgia, where they had a sample size of nearly 22,000 students. Wonderful, right? So you can imagine the margin for error, the confidence intervals are very tiny with a sample size that small. And I'm just showing you what the research typically shows you. Usually, either there's no difference or there's a gain. And so over here, they found that OER use improved end of course grades and it decreased DFW rates for all students. DFW rates is the kind of metric that many administrators run around with. It's a proportion of students who earn a D, earn an F as grades, or who withdraw from the course, and it's aggregated. So it's often a sort of basket collection of suboptimal course outcomes, if you will. But here's the best part. Not only does OER have this effect very consistently in the literature, but it has a disproportionately positive effect on the more marginalized students in your classes, right? So it improves course grades at greater rates, decreases DFW rates at greater rates for Pell recipient students. So this is primarily a funding mechanism in the US for based on socioeconomic class. Part-time students, populations historically underserved by higher education, right? And so what I love about this is just as, in fact, marginalized students, whether you're students of color, first-gen students, students holding a loan, those are the students who disproportionately make those negative choices when it comes to textbooks, choosing a course, dropping a course, all of that. They're disproportionately benefiting now from the use of OER. So it's a fabulous interactive intervention. Now, I mentioned that I spent a lot of time in BC. For the last 15 years, I was at Kwantlen Polytechnic University. So I want to share some of the things that they're doing that I hope the rest of the country will continue to learn from. But at KPU, I would say it's the national leader when it comes to working with open education. Here's an example of a very long catalog of textbooks that KPU faculty publish. There's a robust open textbook publishing program at KPU, grants to support OER adoption, adaptation, creation. As a faculty member, you don't have to worry about running around thinking about graphic design or copy editing. There's a whole team that will back you up for this, in addition to getting things like course release and time to work on this. So lots of lessons over there. And it sounds like this is a substantial institutional investment, and it is, but there's a reason why. KPU launched in 2018 Canada's first zero textbook cost programs. And so I mean moving towards a more programmatic approach. So instead of just a happy surprise, oh, I found an instructor who's using an open educational resource, wonderful. No, we can do this intentionally. So entire degree programs, including many bachelor's programs, where the entire 4-year degree has zero textbook costs altogether. I often talk about this, or I used to talk about this as the equivalent of giving every student a $1,000 scholarship, for example, because that's basically what it amounts to every year. At this point, KPU has 8 degree programs. They've saved more than $8 million in student savings. But here's the educational impact, because we've looked at this every semester. And for the 4 years that I was there running this program, every semester, every single faculty, not one exception for undergraduate studies, there was an increase in enrollment for courses that were zero textbook cost or ZTC. There was an increase in persistence, or a lower withdrawal rate, for example, and a higher performance across the board. And so we saw things like courses were higher, filling more, waitlists were about 2.5 times the size, because we made it searchable in the course timetable for students as well. It also meant we could analyze the institutional data with that course attribute as well. So that's why I was able to go to the board and talk about, here's the impact on tuition retained by the institution. This is why it's important to fund this. This more than funds itself when it comes to OER grants. But of course, I mean, that's exciting. But in some ways, that's just the start. Because you look at the research in open education, the scholarship, and one of my favorite colleagues and scholars, Sarah Lambert at Deakin University in Australia, put forward a wonderful framework to help people understand how we could go beyond saving students money. So in advancing the social justice framework, she distinguished between redistributive justice, recognitive justice, and representational justice. Very helpful. Put simply, redistributive justice is really about reallocating resources, right, to those who have less by circumstance. So good example, swap an expensive commercial textbook for an open textbook. They've saved a lot of money. That's redistributive justice right there. Fairly easy. But you can go further, right? If you go to recognitive justice, you're talking about things like sociocultural diversity in the classroom, right? Think about students in the classroom. Think about the examples, the names even, and the examples in the text. Can they start to reflect the diversity in your classroom, for example? Is that not a wonderful use of the permission to revise, to do that? So that's a subtle way to go further beyond simply adopting, because you can adopt an open textbook in exactly the same way as you would adopt, a textbook from Pearson. I mean, especially if you print it out, it looks, smells, and tastes like a commercial textbook. Just doesn't have the bitter aftertaste. But you can go further still, right? With representational justice, you can actually talk about co-creating knowledge with students. This is where we're going to talk about open pedagogy in a moment, including things like co-construction of OER about learners of color by learners of color. So when we talk about open pedagogy, this is often what we mean. Open pedagogy means many things, but it's often We can think about it as an access-oriented commitment to learner-driven education, but it's also the process of using tools for learning or building architectures for learning that allow students to shape the public knowledge commons of which they are a part. So a very popular, I'll talk about the popular manifestation of open pedagogy, but even if you think about agency in the classroom, what if you allowed students to shape the learning journey, right? What if we didn't stay binded to our learning outcomes as though we can sort of predict what the journey of learning is going to look like before we've ever met our students, right? What if we allow them agency in choosing the topics, in adjusting the schedules of work, in, let's say, developing the course policies? I can tell you, I'm as the kids say on TikTok, I'm old enough to remember when we had laptop bans in the classroom, right? And it's funny to talk about it now because those ableist laptop bans were quickly replaced during the pandemic with ableist camera on policies on your laptops, which was hilarious, right? It was never about the laptops. It was always about control. But I say this because, of course, coming through, when I co-developed policies, even about technology use in the classroom with my students, you'd be amazed. Usually students are more conservative than the instructor would be. But the difference is you don't have to police a policy when they've developed it. It's their policy. They own it. It's their agency. It's a different story you're telling. But as I said, maybe the most popular manifestation of open pedagogy comes through when you work with students in the context of assignments. Now, this is an image I love to show people because, first of all, it's an open educational resource. It's an image from the public domain. It's from a French book that was published over 100 years ago. And it depicted various scenarios from the future. This one happened to be the classroom of the future, which I love, right? I suppose the classroom of the year 2000. So for them, the future, for us, the recent past. And I love to share this because I think it's easier to understand open pedagogy in relief. So think about the ideology that permeates this illustration for a moment. What is the notion of teaching and learning over here? Who is permitted to be in the classroom, first of all, right? Who's allowed to be the professor? Who's allowed to be a student? There's not a lot of diversity in this classroom. And then, of course, the folks from CTL should be wondering about the absence of active learning, the absence of peer assessment, interaction, the absence of even any note-taking, right? You have this electronic relay system that's somehow delivering information to students' minds. And in case you're missing it, please look at the graduate student doing the actual manual labor of assessment. So this is almost a textbook case of what the Brazilian philosopher educator Paulo Freire described as the banking concept of education, right? And in his book, Pedagogy of the Oppressed, Freire described this model. He says, it turns them, students, into containers to be filled by the teacher. The more completely she fills the receptacles, the better a teacher she is. The more meekly the receptacles permit themselves to be filled, the better students they are. And so education thus becomes the act of depositing, in which students are the depositories and the teacher is the depositor. Here's the last bit, which has a lot to unpack. In the banking concept of education, knowledge is a gift bestowed by those who consider themselves knowledgeable upon those whom they consider to know nothing. And if that sounds extreme, again, we pretend to claim to know what the journey of learning will look like through those tightly held learning outcomes before we've met our students. And I say this only half in jest because, of course, I do appreciate the benefits of backwards course design and aligning your assessments and activities and assessments. But it's also peculiar to pretend like the journey is not going to evolve as we meet our students. I also think about this in the context of the learning management system and the incredibly common practice that we might build a beautiful architecture in Blackboard. You might use it in a semester. At the end of the semester, you think, I'm going to archive that. I'm probably going to reuse that. I did a good job. I want to reuse those activities, structure of those forums. I like that. But the one thing we do before that is we wipe all traces of student activity before we reuse that, right? So we're reaffirming. I told you at the start of the journey that you're not really going to affect it. And now I've confirmed it. All of that labor was useless. And so this is where open pedagogy can come in as well, right? You can really harness, you can move away from traditional assignments that are often called disposable assignments, even though I know that sounds a bit pejorative, to assignments that are designed to have a larger audience, a bigger impact, and a longer life. These are what we call renewable assignments. Right? Lots of examples of this, and I will start with one of the darker corners of the internet for faculty, Wikipedia. Right? Probably number 2 after ratemyprofessor.com, or maybe number 3 after ChatGPT now, I don't know. And I say this because, again, this is one of those classic knee-jerk Thou shalt not cite Wikipedia in this research essay, commandments in higher education. But again, it's, I think, a great example of higher education burying its head in the sand and really abdicating our responsibility. Because who is in a better position to use this widely, or to address and improve this widely used public resource than us, working with our students? Be like Amin Azam. He's a faculty member at the University of California who worked with his medical students every semester to write, improve, add articles for a variety of medical topics on Wikipedia. Yes, these are students who at some point may become general physicians. Patients walk into a clinic and in a few minutes, they need to explain complex medical concepts in lay terms. What a great way to practice, as it turns out, right? But we can do better. So we can move from research essays to Wikipedia assignments. We can move from in-class presentations, that the death by PowerPoint that happens in the classroom, the sacrifice of classroom time that we claim is so cherished, and instead work with students to create instructional videos. Here's an example of two students from Simon Fraser University in BC who created a 3-minute video about Cialdini's principles of persuasion, which of course Virgil will know as well as I do as a psychologist. They submitted it to an international student video competition. They won. What did they win? First place. Look at that, $6,000 US, which is 43,000 US or whatever it is, or Canadian. But the point is, their video is now being used to teach the science of persuasion by educators around the world, and that's the power of open pedagogy, right? This student intellectual labor is not useless. It is not worth flushing from the LMS. Loads of other examples, and I'll try to show you some gentle ones. If you're using an open textbook, and I know many of you are using the digital annotation tool Hypothesis even at Trent, you can use this tool as an open pedagogy exercise. So you're seeing on the left a section of a text in social psychology that I'd worked on. On the right, you're seeing screenshots of my students annotating the text. In one case, augmenting the example in the text from a lived experience from her life to provide another illustration of a psychological concept. At the bottom, providing an external example, a video clip to illustrate something again. Just a small example, right? You don't have to, we're long past, but I hesitate to say we're long past because I'm sure there are people still quoting Seinfeld references and for flashbulb memory talking about 9/11, even though most of our students were not alive at that point. But you don't need to come up with relatable examples. The students are in a better position to do it. They can enrich the text for you as an educator. They have a role to play identifying bottleneck concepts, and annotating OER is a really simple way of having a renewable assignment. Students can author OER too, of course, right? These are students at the Ohio State University who wrote bite-sized chunks about environmental science. The volume was edited and overseen by the faculty in the program. And again, Environmental Science Bites is an open textbook co-authored by students. This is open pedagogy in action. And you can go even further. This is maybe my favorite example. This is from KPU. Students in an applied communications course, they did a research project. They chose textbook affordability. Good for them. Right? They interviewed students across the campus, did quantitative, qualitative work. Then they went further. They developed a tabletop game with cards, almost like Monopoly, based on the actual lived experiences of students they interviewed. And this ended up becoming a professional development activity for educators to perspective take with students. You start the semester making decisions, limited amount of money, which textbooks am I going to buy? I'm going to buy this one used. I'm going to skip that access code. Okay. Then you go through the semester. Oh, I realize I can't get through this course without a textbook now that I've hit the midterm exam. So they have to make a decision. They have random life events that take place as well. And you drop your phone in the toilet. You have to fly home to India because somebody in your family has passed. These are real experiences. This is now online using H5P, if anybody knows that interactive open source technology. It's an educational development game. This is an example of open pedagogy in a beautiful fashion, but in a way that also gives students not just agency, but it allows them to engage in critical pedagogy, right? And critical pedagogy, of course, and I'm quoting Henry Giroux from McMaster over here, it asserts that students can engage their own learning from a position of agency. It takes seriously the educational imperative to encourage students to act on the knowledge, values, and social relations they acquire by being responsive to the deepest and most important problems of our times. And as we think about the deepest, most important problems of our times, we should be thinking about things like on our campuses, food insecurity, absolutely. But on a grander scale, of course, we can think about the Sustainable Development Goals from the United Nations as well. So here's an example of an open pedagogy fellowship we've been running at KPU. I say we, but I still feel some ownership over here. But we helped faculty members to design assignments which involved open pedagogy, where students would end up creating open resources that would each end up serving progress towards a specific sustainable development goal. Good example, you're seeing a collaborative assignment over here, faculty members from urban ecosystems, sustainable horticulture, anthropology from different institutions. They developed a project that focused on food insecurity. They mapped out the edible weeds on the different campuses of the different institutions, contributing to a scientific quality public database. Lots of student skill development there, but you're actually addressing something that's a critical issue. It's beautiful, right? This is what education for me looks like at its finest. And I don't want to speak for the faculty member over here. This is one of my dear former colleagues, Jen Hardwick, who is an educator who inspires me. I think she says it better than I could. So I'm going to let her tell you why she embraces open pedagogy.
For the last 5 or 6 years, and I've used renewable assignments before and media assignments before, and I think they're very effective. I think they allow a kind of creativity and engagement that a lot of other assignments don't. And I am a writing instructor primarily. I'm interested in good communication, and I think that that communication should extend in the digital age to different kinds of assignments, different ways of employing rhetoric and self-expression. And so this is a good opportunity to encourage students to think about those skills. I'm also interested in using open pedagogy because I want students to think deeply about it, and I want them to think about access to information and the ethics that guide that. Both the ethics of what we see now in education in terms of the high costs of textbooks and the inaccessibility of a lot of resources, but also on the other end, the way that the academy has been complicit in extracting knowledge and in monetizing knowledge that doesn't necessarily belong to the people who are doing the extracting. And so I want students thinking carefully about the information that they gather and the information that they share, and how to do that in ethical ways. And I think that open assignments are a great way to introduce those conversations.
Jen is fabulous.
Because
So one of the sites that we put together, this is my colleague Robin DeRosa, who's at Plymouth State University in New Hampshire, we put together the Open Pedagogy Notebook. So if you visit openpedagogy.org, this is meant to serve a couple of purposes. One, it's meant to be a library. Just if you're interested in browsing through examples, what does open pedagogy look like in practice at the assignment level, at the course level, in different disciplines? You can browse through, but it's also an invitation to contribute, right? So you can share, it could be a budding idea or a fully tested, classroom tested practice. This is meant to be a space for community and sharing. Now, of course, as we talk about open pedagogy still, I think there's a number of things you can do with open pedagogy. You can use it to move your teaching from more content-centric, if you will, right, covering the content, to more process-centric, which is, of course, wonderful. You can go from being a little less teacher-centric to being a little more student-centric, particularly in terms of giving students agency, and choice. But you can also go from designing your courses and learning environments from being primarily about being effective and engaging to also designing for intention to embed social justice. And I say this because, just because you're embracing open pedagogy does not mean you're actually doing something that serves justice. As we outlined in this article I co-wrote with my colleagues Mahabali and Catherine Cronin, it is possible to do something as exciting as open pedagogy and actually perpetrate harm. Absolutely. If you do not adequately scaffold your student skill development, if you ignore the fact that minoritized students are disproportionately targeted in online flame wars in Wikipedia, if you don't think through the ethics of the digital footprint you're asking students to leave when it comes to digital or public scholarship, you could do harm. It could be, of course, positive. And if it's positive, it's often good, it's ameliorative, but it stops short of being transformative. And so, for example, context where this may be ameliorative, as we write, is where you address economic injustice, you make scholarship generally accessible, you're using OER, you're publishing OER, of course, it's going to have a positive effect. But transformative means you actually start to change some of the assumptions along the way, right? One of the things from my perspective that's always an issue is if you undercompensate or do not compensate authors of OER, for example, you end up with this practice being reserved for those who are already enjoying substantial privilege. Tenured faculty members, maybe those who don't need the additional revenue, for example, or compensation. And so then you end up with a field of OER that is overrepresented in ideology that's associated with that privilege. So at a subtle level, but a more serious level, there's structural academic gatekeeping that we can challenge if we want to leverage open pedagogy in a way that is socially just by design, if that makes sense. And as I talk about that, of course, I always come in my mind is the words of the incredible Arundhati Roy, who wrote that there's no such thing as the voiceless. Right? In the academy, we often talk about that. Right? We parade words like the meritocracy as though it has some meaning over here. We're lying to ourselves. But no, there are only the deliberately silenced, the preferably unheard. So let's think critically about what are the epistemologies that are not admitted into the academy. Right? What are the layers and layers and layers that we are trying to swim past over here? So of course, what I'm talking about in many ways is a need to rebuild many of our systems in higher education. And I think this was long in the coming, but the pandemic, of course, exacerbated this need. It made visible to many people who were not seeing barriers before. It made them more visible, not to those who were experiencing it, of course, but all of a sudden, did you notice how much easier it became for us to deal with things like captioned videos, recorded lectures, things that we can't do that, we can't do that. Now, that's disappeared. It's quite fascinating, right? So there's a lot that I think we need to rebuild over here. And part of it has to do with going back to this notion of care. And I mean care in a few different ways. But a pedagogy of care for me reflects this quote from Bell Hooks. To teach in a manner that respects and cares for the souls of our students, she wrote, is essential if we are to provide the necessary conditions where learning can most deeply and intimately begin. But again, care and self-care, because the labor of care, again, disproportionately tends to fall on not all faculty. And the self-care is something that gets neglected. I'm acutely aware that when I talk about the practices of the commercial textbook industry, one of the reasons why they were so successful in price gouging students and exploiting their business model is because they were able to prey on the desire and need for convenience among faculty who were the ones who were willing to go the extra mile for their students. Right? There's a need that they're filling, and that's the need that's being addressed. So the question for me is, why is it that faculty members are so desperate for that convenience? Why is it that there's such a desperate need to alleviate that workload? Then we start to understand how the relationship of self-care looks to the relationship of a pedagogy of care, for example. I'll share a few quotes over here, and this is a beautiful one, a tweet from a colleague, Vijay Sathi, who's written a book recently about inclusive teaching. This is stark, but maybe you'll agree. Sometimes she tweeted, I see things that make me think we treat the classroom as something less than a sacred shared space and more like a hostage situation. But I think during the pandemic, one of the ways in which this was on grand display was through what I think was a bit of a fetishization, if you will, of the concept of rigor. And I would say rigor is interesting because it's a mask, I think, for many things. Karen Costa is another scholar who's written about this. In fact, she tweeted about this. I'll show you another screenshot. So rigor, she thinks, can stand for, it can be a representation of trauma, of tradition, of insecurity, of incompetence, of fear, of anger. But most often it manifests in the form of inflexibility, right? So hence, when I hear somebody talk about rigor today, I still, in my mind, I think about rigor mortis, right? The sort of, post-mortem rigidity, stiffening of the body's muscles, right? And think about how this looks in the classroom. No, you may not have an extension. Yes, you must keep your camera on. No, I will not cut any content from this course. Yes, you must hand over your intellectual property to this plagiarism detection platform. No, I will not excuse your absence unless I see a copy of the obituary notice. This is common. This is really, really common. This is cruelty being paraded under the banner of rigor in the academy. That's one of the issues. And it's become even bigger. Douglas Dowland wrote about this, and he said the rhetoric of rigor turns pedagogy into pathology. And so it seems, as I said, the last 2 years, it was very amusing to me moving from the laptop bans to you must have a laptop and you must have the camera on. That was very, very comical to me. So when I think about how we rebuild higher education, I think a lot of it has to do with humanizing higher education, right? I think we need to recognize that pedagogy and technology are entangled. I think we need to, well, let's talk about ChatGPT as a case in point, since that's the hot topic at the moment. I think just when we moved online with the emergence or the pivot to emergency remote teaching, if I'm going to be honest, I would say it revealed a lot of poor instructional design that was suddenly made visible, that was hidden in classrooms before that. People in Centers for Teaching and Learning know this, right? But OpenAI is revealing right now the range of poor assessment practices that proliferate in higher education, right? A formulaic question will yield a formulaic answer, whether it's from a human or whether it's from ChatGPT. Lower order tasks is what ChatGPT is fabulous at. But I also think people, I'm not suggesting that we should necessarily embrace ChatGPT and use it for teaching and learning. You can, absolutely you can. You can use it to design discussion prompts and to support learning activities. You can have your students build on its work and think critically about the output, absolutely. But before you do that, I think we need to think critically around privacy. We need to think about the other ethical implications of this, right? Any IP that's handed over to that platform is being monetized. It's already being monetized by OpenAI. Again, we need to think critically about that information literacy that our students need. So whether it comes, this goes to ChatGPT or DALL-E, which can be used for images. Again, I'm not suggesting we regress to pen and pencil assessments and oral examinations necessarily. I also don't think we jump in uncritically. I think what we need to do, though, is not force students to hand over their IP to OpenAI. And I think as educators, we need to reflect on what we do in the classroom. What is our role, right? If we can be replaced with a video, I'm not sure we're educating, right? If your assignments can be completed by ChatGPT, I'm not sure those assignments were worth actually designing in the first place, right? We can go much, much further, but I think we need to do this critically. And we need to do it again, mindful of those who are at the margins. This is a quote from Amy Collier, who's one of our heroes at Middlebury College, who wrote correctly that there's no such thing as the harmless collection of data or the benevolent collection of data. Much of what we collect could be used in ways we do not want it to be used, to harm or imperil our students. And as usual, this will disproportionately affect our most vulnerable students, low-income students, students of color, LGBTQ plus students, students who are immigrants. It's their data who are most at risk to surveillance discrimination. And many of our vulnerable students are less likely to have experience with digital literacy skills. In the US, of course, the stakes are even higher. But the notion that a college instructor could require a student to leave a digital footprint as part of something like using Turnitin.com, that digital footprint actually being able to be used to identify and deport if they're a dreamer, a member of their family, that's not fiction. That's the kind of implication we're talking about over here. So what I think we need is a more critical, a more inclusive, and obviously a more open approach, but one that needs to start with trust for students and also trust for faculty, right? I want to share a wonderful insight from Christina Katapodis, who wrote that if we're going to talk about rigor, she wrote, let us ensure we have rigorous standards of flexibility and accessibility. If we're going to talk about academic integrity, I mean, again, that's a handy phrase. It's a little more sanitized than talking about student cheating, let's say. That's what people mean. They're talking about student academic misconduct. But in my mind, academic integrity is a broader concept, one that affects the behavior of faculty as well. Proper instructional design that fits the course delivery mode, that demonstrates academic integrity, right? So let's have a broader conversation about what that means, extended to our own ethics and our own approach to both technology and pedagogy. Let us obviously lead with care, but not forget about self-care. And let us build supports and structures that support humans and that actually foster humanity. This may be the last book I'll point to over here. It's another wonderful one. A friend of ours, Kevin Gannon, who was at Grandview and he's moved now. I'm trying to remember the institution he's at. But it's a beautiful book, Radical Hope, a teaching manifesto. And in it, he writes about how the real work of change in higher education is done students by students, classroom by classroom, course by course. And it's done by educators who have committed to teaching because it and their students matter. I think it's spot on. But from my perspective, we need to make it easier for those who are trying to turn the tide in higher education so that they're not constantly swimming against the stream, swimming against the current. And that's where we can change things structurally. As I finish, I'm going to go back to the image that was lurking behind my title slide. And when I came in with Terry early, he already began to guess what this might be. But I want to ask those who were not associated with this event to try and guess. Is anyone able to identify the mountain range we're looking at? Table Mountain is right. That's right. It is at Cape Town. This is Table Mountain. You're seeing Cape Town just at the foot of Table Mountain over there. It's a beautiful place. So when I took this photograph in 2017, I think it was my first visit to South Africa. Obviously, I'm not standing in Cape Town when I take this picture. I'm across the water on Robben Island. I don't know if that rings a bell for anybody, but for a long, long time, Robben Island, of course, it was originally a leper colony, and then it became a maximum security prison for political prisoners. And this is where, among many, 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 many other inmates, former president of South Africa, Nelson Mandela, spent 18 years of his 27-year prison sentence on Robben Island. One of the reasons why I recommend visiting soon is because it is still the case that the tour guides on the island are all former inmates at the moment. And so when I visited, we actually have a chance to really have conversations about what their days were like, those small ways in which they maintained hope or demonstrated resistance, right? It was a beautiful conversation. It was a memorable visit for me. And I think many of the reasons why this was a transformative educational experience for me is because I think education at its finest is democratizing. It is liberatory. It is anti-racist. It is decolonizing. But it is also critical. It is also inclusive. And it is certainly open. I'll stop there. Thank you very much for listening, folks. I hope you have a chance for a chat.